to welcome our next speaker, who's stepping in for Professor Pete Lunn. This is Dr. Shane Timmons from the Economic and Social Research Institute, as well as Trinity College Dublin. Shane, if you can hear me, there we go, thank you. You can in fact just start sharing your screen, and it should theoretically push Nina out of the way. I've put a spotlight on you so we can see you. Yes, without further ado, you're going to be telling us about steps into the future, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marla. Yeah, and just to explain as well, so Pete was originally scheduled to speak today, but the committee that he sits on that actually commissions the research that we're doing on COVID-19 had a meeting rescheduled to this morning, so I'm going to be filling his shoes. Just a very quick introduction to the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute in Ireland. We carry out research to inform policy, and importantly, we're independent from the government. So any of the research that we do to inform that policy is made publicly available, so long as it meets the sufficient academic standard. But it's in essence, we make this available regardless of whether it supports a government position or not. And that's something that's quite important to us. I'm a member of the Behavioural Research Unit. So we're a multidisciplinary team of scientists that specialise in applying behavioural science to policy. Very much a mix of people with economics backgrounds, psychology backgrounds. We have maths and neuroscience represented as well. And most of our research is commissioned by state bodies and government departments here in Ireland. But we also do some international research with the OECD and the European Commission as well. The last few months have we very much focused on our COVID-19 research. This has been commissioned by the Department of Health here in Ireland. Initially, we conducted a review of how behavioural science might be used to inform the response to the pandemic. This was done in early March, and it's since been published in the Journal of Behavioural Public Administration. And then since late March, we've conducted a series of experiments. So one of them was on motivating social distancing, one on decision aids that might support self-isolation, one to do with public expectations of lifting restrictions, one on perceptions of the exit strategy as we come out of lockdown. We've done a pre-test of the contact tracing app. One of our latest ones was on a comparison of public and expert perceptions of risk factors in social settings, framing effects and social desirability in compliance monitoring surveys. And our very last one was a diagnostic test of the decision to self-isolate and people's recognition of COVID-19 symptoms. So we've done quite a lot over the last few months. We have working papers available on our website with this first three. We're working on getting the rest of them out as quickly as possible. But today I'm going to talk about this experiment that we did testing perceptions of the exit strategy from lockdown. To give you some context of how the pandemic, I guess, unfolded in Ireland, we had the first case on the island on the 27th of February. So this was someone from Northern Ireland who arrived back and travelled through Dublin. The first case of someone resident in Ireland was on the 29th of February. And by around 8th or 9th of March, we were seeing quite a lot of community transmission. And at this time, the St. Patrick's Day celebrations were cancelled. So St. Patrick's Day is on March 17th. So these were cancelled by the government on the 9th of March. On the 12th of March, schools, colleges, childcare all closed. And then one thing that I think is quite important to note is that there was quite a lot of public appetite for restrictions to be imposed that actually came ahead of the government imposing these restrictions. So for example, on the 14th of March, 3 days before our national holiday, hashtag close the pubs trended on Twitter. The next day, pubs were closed by the government, and over the next week, non-essential shops, etc., closed. And then on the 27th of March, an official kind of lockdown was announced, even though the real transition into it was quite gradual. So one of the measures was that you had to essentially stay at home as much as possible. You were allowed out to shop for essentials and to exercise, but you had to stay within 2 kilometers of your home. And this lockdown period lasted, in fact, 7 weeks. But on the 1st of May, the government was to publish a roadmap on how we would transition out of lockdown. So we conducted our study the week before on people's perceptions of how this transition period, I guess, might roll out. So Firstly, just to note that the roadmap for transitioning out of lockdown in Ireland was quite similar to other countries in that it was set up to proceed over a series of phases. And so here we have 5 phases. This was later revised to 4 phases. But for this experiment, it's important to note that we're not testing people's perceptions of specific rules or changes to the lockdown restrictions that were imposed, but we're looking at the implementation of the review process, so how we transition between those different phases. 2 key components of it that we're interested in is the time period between them, and the expected outcome. So I'll explain that in a bit more detail. So our first research question was whether the time period between reviews matters. So we know that from the incubation period of the virus that you need about 3 to 4 weeks to assess the impact of any changes. But we wondered whether this would be too long of a period of uncertainty. So we know that people are averse to uncertainty, and maybe 3 to 4 weeks would be too long to stay in one period without getting feedback essentially on the transmission rate of the virus. Our second research question was whether the framing of the outcome matters. So whether people, I guess, expect the next phase to be an automatic, I guess, transmission, or whether lockdown restrictions might be reimposed. So we thought that if there was an expectation that restrictions would continue to ease, that might induce hope and optimism in the public. Whereas if there was the promise of reimposed measures, that might provide some reassurance. And also there might be more, I guess, complicated psychological components here. So if one of these outcomes, I guess, is perceived as the default, people might react negatively if that default is essentially taken away. And then our third research question is whether there might be an interaction between these two factors. So for our method, we recruited a nationally representative sample of 800 participants to take part in a study online. They were paid €7. It took about 20 minutes in total. And the sort of main design for this component was a 2x2. So we varied the time period and the framing of the outcome. So I'll show you what participants saw. We essentially put together this announcement that was mocked to look like the government website. So here we just said, we thank everyone for cooperating with the public health measures to combat the coronavirus. The spread has been slowed and some easing of restrictions is now possible. The government has decided to do this gradually with measures reviewed every 2 weeks. But some people saw this as every month instead. So we varied whether it was a 2-week review period or a 4-week review period in essence. You'll see here that some of the changes, we weren't really interested in people's responses to these changes, but they were quite innocuous. So it was just non-essential shops can reopen, parks and beaches and outdoor amenities that had closed can reopen. This limit of exercise within 2 kilometers can be extended to 5 kilometers. Schools may reopen for students who are sitting their end of school exams, and people who are cocooning could leave their homes for walks of up to 30 minutes daily. So these were all restrictions that I guess were being mooted by the government at the time, so that we were able to use those in this hypothetical announcement. And then people were told that all other restrictions would remain in place. Everyone must stay at home as much as possible and keep at least 2 meters between themselves and others, etc. The second manipulation then was this component down here at the bottom, where every 2 weeks or every month we will study the data. If the spread of COVID-19 does not stay under control, we may need to bring restrictions back in for the following 2 weeks or month, and any further easing will be delayed. So we're calling this the negative frame. Whereas in the positive frame, this message said if the spread of COVID-19 remains under control, these changes will be kept and we may be able to ease more restrictions. Okay, so that's the key difference here between these two, the negative frame and the positive one. We programmed the experiment in Gorilla and pre-registered the materials and research questions, etc., on the open science framework. We're interested in a few dependent variables, just to give an overview of some of them here. So we're interested in people's immediate affective response to it. So whether they thought it might be good or bad news, whether they would be encouraged or discouraged by it, or whether they were optimistic or pessimistic about the future. We're also interested in their perceived impact on daily life from reading the announcement. So did they think their life would improve, how easy it would be to cope with it, how likely they would be to stick to the regulations, and how likely they thought others might be too. And finally, then, their confidence in Ireland's ability to manage the pandemic as we transition out of lockdown. Okay, so to some results. So how did the announcement make people feel? So all of these were Likert scale responses from 1 to 7. So in general, the response is quite positive. So 73% of people were above the midpoint here, thinking that the announcement was good news. A similar amount were encouraged by it, and again, a similar amount felt optimistic by it. So broadly speaking, the announcement was viewed as positive, even though those changes, as I mentioned, were quite minor. In terms then of how our manipulations affected people's responses, so we've modeled these. What I'm going to present here essentially is the standard deviation change on an aggregate score for this effective response. So if we average across those 3 measures, and here on the y-axis is the standard deviation change. So if they read that the review will be every 2 weeks, and the emphasis on the outcome was about lockdown essentially, or further restrictions being reimposed, people actually felt better about that sort of announcement. Whereas if the time period was every month, they felt worse about it. So even though the outcome was the same here, we can see that there was an effect of the review period. When we look at the positively framed outcome, this pattern in essence reversed. So here we have people feeling worse about the 2-week review period when the outcome was positive, and better about the monthly review period when the outcome was positive compared to negative. And this interaction is significant, which suggested to us at least that there was a trade-off between the length of the review period and the highlighted outcome of the review, such that the preferred reviews were that restrictions would be quickly reimposed if they were needed, or that restrictions would be gradually lifted if it was safe. And again, this is not participants choosing between different review periods. Everyone saw one of them, so it was a between subject manipulation. On the impact of the announcement on daily life, again, so we have about half of people saying that their life would improve. Most of them thought that it would be easy to cope with these restrictions. The likelihood to stick with the restrictions is quite interesting. So most people judge that they themselves would be very likely to stick with and comply with the restrictions, whereas they were much more pessimistic when it came to their opinion of others. So this suggests that most people would be able to cope okay with these just slight changes to lockdown restrictions, but this perceptions of non-compliance with others became important for some of the sort of later surveys on COVID-19 in Ireland. And just to plot the same results here. So again, 2 weeks negative, there was a positive impact on people's perceptions of how their daily life will be affected by it. And again, we're getting that negative effect of the month negative condition, negative effect of 2 weeks positive, and again, a positive effect of the month positive. So we're getting this exact same interaction here, where there was a preference for announcements that highlighted how restrictions would be quickly reimposed if they were needed and gradually lifted if it was safe. And then when we looked at overall confidence, people were mostly confident that Ireland would be able to cope with the pandemic, and that we've done quite well so far. And again, we're getting this exact same effect. So there's an interaction here between that review period and the framing of the outcome. So again, just to reiterate, there was a preference here for that the short, long review period depended essentially on how that outcome was framed. We did have some additional measures that we were interested in, so on maintaining compliance going forward. One of these was on people's judgments of acceptability of what we've called marginal behaviours. So these are behaviours that were not permitted in essentially the next phase or the first phase of the roadmap, but people might judge them to be safe and okay. So these are things like arranging to call to someone's house for a chat in the garden, cycling 10 kilometers, so breaching the radius, but in order to do something nice for someone who's cocooning, or having a picnic in the park with members of your household. So these weren't permitted, but we thought people might judge that they're okay. And the second aspect of this maintaining compliance that we were interested in is related to this contentious idea of behavioural fatigue. So in the UK, the CMO in England said that there is a risk if we go too early with these with lockdown measures. People will understandably get fatigued, and it will be difficult to sustain it over time. This led to an open letter of behavioural scientists in the UK that some people might be familiar with, questioning the government's, reluctance to impose lockdown measures too early. So this is something that we were kind of interested in this study. We presented people with behavioural fatigue vignettes or dilemmas. I'll give you an example here of one of them. There were 6 in total. So we have the O'Dwyers here, a young family with 2 little boys, aged 3 and 5. They've been finding it hard to stay cooped up during the lockdown, especially since the local beach was closed, as they don't have much space for the boys to run around. They're delighted to hear that beaches are now reopening and head down on the first sunny day. When they get there, the place is more crowded than they expected, as other families have the same idea, but they didn't want to disappoint the children. They decide to stay for an hour at least. So again, this goes against the advice in that the amenity was crowded, so they shouldn't have stayed there. But we thought that given the sort of trade-off here and trying to help the family deal with some of the difficulties during lockdown, that people might judge that it would be acceptable for them to stay for a while. We had an additional manipulation for these measures. So we were interested to see whether people's responses on the time period and the framing of the outcome might matter for this, but we also included a sunk cost manipulation for half of the participants. So the sunk cost fallacy shows that, or describes how people are more likely to continue with an endeavor once they've put some sort of initial investment into it. So we tried to get at this with an additional paragraph that some participants saw. So they read this one down here, that the people of Ireland have made a huge effort that flattened the curve and saved lives, but a second wave of infections is possible. We must not let the huge effort so far go to waste. So we wanted to see whether highlighting a sunk cost might make non-compliance in those marginal behaviours and on those vignettes less acceptable. So on the marginal behaviours, we've combined them again into an aggregate score. There was high internal consistency between them, and this is the distribution of responses across the rating scale, where 1 is that it's completely unacceptable and 7 is that it's completely acceptable. So you can see here we actually got really nice variation. We were happy to see this. And then when we compare the control condition, so the condition who didn't see the sunk cost message, they were about here on the scale, so 4.1, and there was no effect of that sunk cost message. So they're at 4.06 on the scale, so absolutely no difference. On the fatigue dilemmas, again, we were able to create a composite score on them. There was high internal consistency, and again, we got really nice variation in responses. When we model those with the different manipulations that were considered, we found no effect of the time period, no effect of the frame, but there was a small effect of the sunk cost. So we pre-registered a one-directional hypothesis for this. So that one-directional p-value is 0.039. So quite marginal and quite a small effect here of that sunk cost message. Where the sunk cost message, in fact, had a stronger impact was when we looked at people's responses to those earlier dependent variables. How did the announcement make people feel? So again, here's that interaction that I showed you earlier, where people's response to it depended not only on the framing of the outcome, but also on the review period. When we looked at the participants who saw that sunk cost message, this interaction completely disappeared. Again, if I look at the impact on daily life, once I've introduced that sunk cost message, it almost looks like that interaction is reversing, where you can see here, particularly when the month positive condition, that there's a massive drop in people's response. They were more negatively responding to this month positive with this sunk cost manipulation added to it. If we look at overall confidence, this pattern actually has reversed in this case. So this is a significant interaction here that's the complete opposite of the one we had without the sunk cost message. So I appreciate I'm going through this quite quickly, and it is quite a difficult concept to get your head around. It's something that we struggled with quite a lot. So just to sum up this effect of the sunk cost, so there was a small effect of acceptability on non-compliance, only on those fatigue dilemmas, so not on those marginal behaviours. But when combined with the review information, the effects of those, the time period and framing that were quite solid without the sunk cost were nulled and potentially reversed. So we're wondering about the mechanism that might explain this sort of strange effect, I guess. So one potential is that it distracted from the main message of the announcement. We'll be very interested to hear people's thoughts on this. One thing we've wondered is whether it might have widened people's time horizons. So by that, we mean that in the announcement, so the review period was either the next 2 weeks or the next month, and kind of thinking about going forward. Whereas in the sunk costs, you're asking people to consider not only the past behavior that people have engaged in, but also then this risk that there will be future infections coming down the line. So we're wondering, has it, in essence, made people consider these wider time horizons, or maybe just adding this extra paragraph to it added to noise in people's responses. Okay, so to, I guess, summarize what we've done. So evidence for a trade-off there between progress and reassurance on the announcement. This led us to, I guess, recommend that a gradual reopening of society from lockdown is what people would like, with the promise of a quick return to restrictions if necessary. This preference for, I guess, it was quite a cautious preference that wasn't necessarily highlighted in media communications at the time. So I mentioned that we had 7 weeks of lockdown, and the media commentary around this time was very much calling for restrictions to be lifted. But there was much more caution, I guess, detected in this experiment than we expected, and definitely what was kind of commented on at the time. And we've seen this caution borne out in later surveys and experiments. So more recently, restrictions have been lifted quicker than planned because the spread of the virus was very much maintained. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen some minor increases in infection rates here, and they seem to be tracking with growing anxiety in surveys that are being conducted. So the sunk cost message had a very small effect on compliance judgments, again, only in those compliance judgments, not to say that a sunk cost message on its own wouldn't have a stronger effect. But essentially it communicated us the danger of combining too many messages in one communication. And then lastly, just more broadly in terms of this experiment and the previous ones we've done over the last few months, we found that the capacity to run these quick online experiments to be really useful in forming communications about COVID-19. So the working papers that we have available, and this one as well, will be available on our website there. It's esri.ie/BRU. I'm happy to take emails or indeed any comments that people have now or any questions. Especially people's interpretation of why that sunk cost message might have had the effect that it did. But yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Shane, and for your talk and for making it all a little bit more real. I think you are, what you do is a lot less abstract, perhaps, than at least something I do. And I think a lot of your messages are pertinent for both researchers, but also for anybody who is coming from a less scientific background. And thank you so much for making everything so clear. Both your manipulations and your main questions are really very straightforward, even for somebody who's quite far outside from policy to understand. I think I'm going to sort of focus on two things. The one is the one you seem to want some feedback on, which is obviously super interesting, which is this effect of the sunk cost. And you put forward this idea of time, which is really sums up everything you were talking about. You were talking about, framing things on the one hand, but really, within what kind of time frame changes would be made. And so maybe on the matter of time, let's start with, what do you think about people's generally negative response earlier on? So not as we go forward, but earlier on, flip-flopping, people having daily briefings, changing advice at a very small time frame, which, at least in terms of your data for reopenings, which obviously has a very different context to it, seems to be what people want. They want gradual messaging if things are okay, but quick if things are not. And that's clearly what we had. We had daily briefings, people saying, now we're going to do this. And people really didn't like that uncertainty. So what has changed in the context during and say now in this slightly more relaxed phase?
Yeah, so I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there by mentioning uncertainty. I think earlier on in the, certainly in Ireland, with the threat of the virus and that it seemed to be spreading quite quickly, people were uncertain about where it might be and what they need to do. And in that instance, so we know from the review that we did that people are willing to accept uncertainty when it's clearly communicated to them. So if experts and politicians are not, there can be a fear among experts of communicating uncertainty because they don't want to undermine their expertise. But if you can communicate uncertainty clearly, say these are the things we know, these are the things we don't know, this is when we're going to update you as soon as we know, or this is how we're going to figure it out, that can alleviate, I guess, that uncertainty worry that people have. Where I guess uncertainty has worse effects on people is if it's communicated that there's disagreement in the science, or disagreement that can be quite damaging. But earlier on, I think there was this uncertainty that people had, and they very much wanted clarity from experts. So this is where the messaging and the communication was quite important. And then I can speak from the Irish context more so, I guess, but during the lockdown period, people, I guess, gradually became accustomed to it, that it was quite difficult and strange to begin with, but then we saw that habits changed quite quickly. Like from a behavioral science perspective, one of the most difficult things that we try to tackle is the habits that people have, whereas that changed quite quickly actually in lockdown, that there was widespread compliance here, and people were happy to take on those measures. And then as the kind of the promise of reopening came about, again, that uncertainty started to rise. People were uncertain about how this might happen. They had doubts over other people's compliance. And this is also a time where we saw much more misinformation being spread, which is something that I think we've seen globally. So again, in these periods of high uncertainty is where that misinformation tends to take hold. So I guess when people were kind of expecting then lockdown to be lifted, they very much wanted certainty that this will be safe, and that it's okay to do it now. So this is sort of, I guess, something that's been borne out in this research and the data that we have.
So I really I appreciate that focus on uncertainty, and then it sort of has an interaction on what you talked about as widened time horizon. And one thing that strikes me, both in the way things are circulated between the public, but also from policymakers to the public, is that we keep being reminded of time. We get these charts as a function of time, and we have this very vivid image of how long we've been in this, and that curve which we have managed to flatten over this amount of time. And just as as somebody who's interested in metacognition, how we visualize things and bring things to mind and reflect on things, it seems to me that this is something you've done, not with a graph, but by manipulating people's view of how quickly policy will be changed, and but also maybe communicated. And I think that one thing we're not thinking about is how much we're making people focus on this aspect of time. And I think that's probably what your sunk cost is doing. It's reminding people how much they've invested over a certain amount of time. And I wonder if you could maybe manipulate that more specifically. How much time have they actually put in, reminding them in either days or weeks. Days seems very long, maybe weeks seems less long. I don't really know the science behind that exact point, but maybe you could manipulate this aspect of time within sunk cost to see if that's really what's whether this widening horizon is actually to do with just how we conceptualize of time and how we've invested in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting idea. And I guess within that sunk cost message, when we designed it, I'll confess that we hadn't considered its implications with time so much, even though the entire experiment was very much about people's perceptions of the time periods, and dealing with uncertainty and so on. But when this result came out, I was like, oh, that might make sense. It's definitely something that we would like to unpick. And then I think more broadly, there is some potentially really fascinating research that could be done in terms of perceptions of time throughout lockdown. I know anecdotally we hear that we've seen that people think that the month of April was the longest month they've ever experienced. That went on for years, whereas May then seemed to just fly, like it proceeded really rapidly. So people's perceptions of time during lockdown, I think will be something really interesting to look into. And then even I'll say, when I was putting these slides together, so this is the experiment we did in late April, and it almost feels like a lifetime ago compared to now. So I think that that component of people's metacognitive awareness of time, and again, so one, I guess, potentially important implication from this sunk cost message now is that if that effort that went into the lockdown is an effort that was put in place a long time ago, perceptually speaking, then maybe it's less important than now, or than back then when it was something that we were immediately coming out of. So again, I think there's whole body of experiments that we could do just following up on this
I was
and
just
cost
thinking, we
message.
need somebody to do their PhD just on this.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's get some funding. I'm going to have to cut us short there, Shane, but I just want to thank you again, and for Pete, who I'm sure was involved in the background of this, for giving us this very other, more direct policy making perspective. What a lot of the science that has been communicated over the last 2 days is obviously bearing upon, and congratulations on a job well done. I hope everybody will reach out if they have more ideas as to how you can target your messaging in